back to the Catholic Buzz podcast. Thanks for joining us again. My name is Father Daniele, and I'm joined as usual by Josh Sullivan.
Hey, hello.
Welcome to you, Josh.
Thank you.
And Matt Van Milligan.
Hi.
Welcome to you. So
Thank
we're
you.
into our season 6 of the Catholic Buzz podcast, and right off the bat, we're going to continue talking about things that are arising, creating buzz in the Catholic Church. And we're in the season of Advent right now, and Advent is a time to prepare ourselves for the coming of Jesus, both the second coming and, of course, his first coming. But you notice during the season of Advent where our liturgies start to take a little bit of a shift. You know, we kind of get rid of things, maybe no flowers or less flowers. Just the simple wreath is sort of there, and the different colors of the Advent weeks, right? And we kind of try and enter into the Advent season, a time of preparation, by the way we express that, by the way we have our churches set up for liturgy, right? And very interesting, because our liturgy that we have in the Mass should be complementing what we're celebrating, right? And Pope Leo the 14th, who is new on the scene this year as our Holy Father, he met with a group of people who are in charge of liturgy from different various dioceses. He met with them in the Vatican a number of weeks ago, and he spoke about this contentious issue of liturgy, probably for the first time in his pontificate, right? Because we know that it's contentious a little bit, because we know when we're talking about the extraordinary form of the Church, that's the celebrating the Church in Latin, in the pre-Vatican II celebration of the Mass, Pope Francis really came down on restricting the use of that Mass, right? And people were kind of looking forward to Pope Leo as someone who's going to liberate it or make some changes or whatever it might be. So we know it's contentious for that issue. But Pope Leo was talking about the need, when he was talking to these liturgy directors and people representing different dioceses, of the need to really do some further work on our liturgy, to make sure that people are trained well, to make sure that we are celebrating liturgy with reverence. And so people got really excited when he started talking about liturgy, right? So today we're going to talk about what he said about liturgy, but also we're going to look at what does the Church teach about liturgy, because sometimes when you go to one Catholic church or the other, they're kind of doing things that are maybe different, and you see that sometimes when people are standing or sitting or kneeling at different times, but you also see that in other ways as well. So we're going to look at the Vatican II document that on the liturgy. We're going to look at the general instruction of the Roman Missal also, and we'll talk about some abuses that have arisen in the liturgy that should, in good spirit of liturgy, be squashed out of the churches. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. So first, I mentioned the pre-Vatican II Mass already, but it was after the Second Vatican Council that these liturgical reforms came, right? And so just right off the bat, people, speaking of contentious, the Second Vatican Council itself on this topic is very contentious, right? People think the Second Vatican Council just eradicated any tradition of the Church from that point forward into the future. Like nothing that happened before 1965 should be in the liturgies anymore. That's just not the case.
Yeah.
That's not the case. And you can tell that by reading the Church documents, right? However, I would say that there was a movement, if you will, from people who were desiring some change. And I'm going to use the word hijacked the teachings of Vatican II and made changes quickly to the liturgy soon after Vatican II that were not called for in the Vatican II documents, right?
I think that's what happened. Is there's a lot of people that a lot of people that have a problem with Vatican II often haven't read the actual Vatican II documents and what's that. Because you have to remember, like, these are all the bishops and the priests, the bishops and the cardinals from around the entire world that get on and sign on to these changes that are being made in a council like this. And so it's not like this is just like, well, we voted and it's 49 to 51. This is like the whole entire, either they're all on, they're doing that, and so they come home. But like you said, like, this is not a time of internet or cell phones or any of that. This is where like letters and newspaper articles were actually the way to get the news out. So these bishops coming back to preach, or even the priests at the time, they're the sole authority of our faith, if you will, in that area. Like you wouldn't, you'd have to like go to the library and find a document that, 6 months after the fact or a year after the fact to find out what actually, and then in that time probably even translate it from, Latin or Italian into English. And so like there was a lot of people, a lot of personal influence, let's just say, on the way that the Canadian church changed, but also just like the Western churches changed in terms of Vatican II. But if you actually look at what the documents say or how the documents are suggesting we implement this, we're kind of now coming off of that ripple. We swung down low, and now we're coming back up to where getting to be level with what the documents actually say. And I think this is actually what we're talking about the Pope's Pope Francis, and like if we actually do what these documents are suggesting, then there isn't as much of a need for certain extreme liturgies from either side. Like this is the one, like if we do it properly, then it should be what satisfies our faith. So
some of the major changes I think that came from Vatican II that people see or people know of or talk about, right? Anyways, are from Latin to the vernacular language, so the language of the people, right? However, before Vatican II, the priest still gave a homily in the vernacular, right? And so that was one change that was major that people point to. Another one is that the priest who everyone was facing ad orientem, which the priest and the people were facing the same way to worship God, right? This change kind of turned the priest around and moved the altar from a sort of fixed altar at the back of the church, a high altar, to an altar sort of, in the middle of the sanctuary. So now people could see the priest, right? And I don't like saying, people say, well, the priest used to have his back to us. Like that's not what was happening. Everyone was facing the same way in worship of God, with the priest at the front as the leader of the community.
One of the blessings we had when we went to Rome and Italy, we were able to travel for the Jubilee of Youth, was with Bishop Thomas Dowd. And he was telling me when we were actually there, we were at one of the, I think it was Mary Major church, one of the churches. And he said, well, a lot of people always thought that the priest always celebrated that way pre-Vatican. But that's not the case. In these churches, the priest faced the congregation, and we have pictures going back 1920s, we had pictures, and he showed us some pictures that were on the wall of like the priest actually celebrated facing towards the people in some of these areas. And if you look though, the way that they're built in the basilicas or the shape of the cross, you had people behind you, had people on the sides of you, had people. So it was just a normal, like they took a famous public building, they turned it into a church, and the altar went straight in the center of it. You know what I mean? So it wasn't that it was this way was the only way that the church ever celebrated. It was just the more common way that the church celebrated with the high altars and stuff. And that was something I learned I never knew.
Agreed, yeah. And also on that, with the changes of like taking the high altar or the priest kind of moving around, was people were encouraged to have active participation in the liturgy, right? So whereas people would sort of sit in the pews and pray, this was saying full and active participation of the congregation in the liturgy. Yeah. And so all these things together that we just mentioned, together, when we move fast and try and change them pretty quick, created a situation that the church never intended for its liturgies.
And in a lot of ways, the church has spent the last 60
Yeah.
60 years trying to adjust for or kind of react to. So when you set it up, I'm glad you framed a discussion about kind of liturgical abuses or against kind of the authoritative sources that we have for how liturgy ought to be done, because you said this is a pretty contentious issue, and I think a lot of the contention arises from people just kind of labeling things that they don't like in liturgy as liturgical abuses. But, thankfully we can point to something like Sacrosanctum Concilium. And to your point that a lot of people who have kind of these extreme or maybe polemic or politicized, ideologically overdetermined, however you want to say it, approaches to the liturgy, I think on both ends of the spectrum would be surprised if they do a detailed deep dive reading into the document itself. So on the one hand, where people who are like anything after, I don't know, the preconciliar mass is an abuse because they that they shouldn't have changed it. Or on the other end, people who are like, I thought we did away with Latin. Like we'll be surprised. You go into the text and be like, no, Latin is actually still a pretty key part of the liturgy, and insofar as it serves that purpose, because one of the key theses of Sacrosanctum Concilium is the full, active, and conscious participation of the laity in the Mass. So, I think kind of to your point that a lot of the knee-jerk response was, okay, let's lower the bar to what people consider kind of conscious participation, rather than raise our own expectation, our own expectations of what we bring to the liturgy, because it's not something that we passively receive. It's something that we participate in. Again, I think there was a big lowering of the bar to kind of satisfy that conscious participation, where I think we could have done better, or the initial kind of implementers of Vatican II could have done better to integrate that in a way that has better continuity with.
Agreed. I agree with you, because
tradition of the
the intention of Vatican II was to breathe sort of the Holy Spirit into the liturgy, right? And to involve the faithful a little bit, to say like, hey, we're coming here to worship, and how do we do that best? What we saw after Vatican II in a lot of places, especially in North America, was sort of creativity enter into the celebration of the liturgies.
Mm-hmm.
So, you saw priests kind of handing off parts of the Mass to people who, have no authority to do so. You had confusion when the permanent diaconate was reinstated, what the role of the deacon was, and then even in some dioceses, what the role of the deacon's wife was in the liturgy. You had this influx of extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, or they say Eucharistic ministers, people say, right? You had this influx of lay people giving out the Eucharist, when the ordinary minister of communion is always the priest, the bishop and the priest. And so you had all these people. Sometimes the priest would sit down, and lay people would give out the Eucharist, right? So all these things together, like whatever Vatican II was intending of really bringing worship into something of an experience, an encounter with Jesus, wasn't working, because it turned into sort of the preference of the people in the parish, right? And that's not worship.
Yeah.
Like, God is pretty specific about how we worship. And so some of the abuses that you see in the parish, so let's take, for example, right away, people's beautiful churches, a lot of them were white. The art on the walls were whitewashed, right? Painted over. Stained glass windows were removed. High altars were torn down with axes, and statues were removed.
There's this feeling that, okay, Vatican II happened. Now we're getting rid of tradition. And we're now just going to do it on our own again. And that's where I feel like that feeling became. So we're going to, like you said, we're going to whitewash the walls and all the icons. We're going to take down all the pictures and the beautiful artwork. We are going to rip down the high altars. Why do you have to rip down the high altar? I understand that the altar is there. But why, in a lot of churches that are still standing, that still have a high altar, let's say, they just put another altar in where they can turn and face the people, and they kept the high altar there with the beautiful statues and the reliquaries and and where the tabernacle lies and everything else. But at some points, they had the high altar there. One of the churches I was at had the high altar there, had the place where the tabernacle was and all the statues, and had actually removed the tabernacle and put it off to the side. They still had the high altar there, but they had taken Jesus and put it off to the side. And none of this was a requirement of Vatican II at all. You know what I mean? And so there was that's I guess people's opinion that we're kind of coming into this as to why they should do that. And you're seeing more and more now as we realize, okay, where does it say this? Oh, it doesn't say this. Okay, let's put it back.
Yeah, and in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, there was this, lots of priests were sent off to study liturgy. Mm-hmm. And what they were learning when it came to liturgy was I don't know, this sort of idea of being creative, right? And so you see a lot of priests now nearing the end of their priestly career who have studied liturgy kind of say that, like, well, I studied liturgy and this is what it says. Like, we no longer need sort of a cross, crucifix anywhere in the sanctuary. The presider's chair should be at the center of the sanctuary, because the altar is the main focus of the mass, right? And okay, well, when mass begins, the altar is the place of sacrifice, right? So we acknowledge the altar as the place where the sacrifice will take place. But to say that trumps a tabernacle with Jesus Christ in it is just ludicrous and doesn't make any logical sense or theological sense, right? But there was this like power struggle, and like, well, I studied and I know, and so you started to see like church started becoming like an expression of of a committee's will for liturgy. One of the things Pope Leo talked about in his address to the diocesan leaders there was for liturgy committees in parishes to be trained well and to have knowledge of liturgy. So, we were talking about reading documents. Yeah. Matt reads the general instruction of the Roman Missal for fun. Like things like that people should they know that stuff if they're going to make some liturgical decisions of a parish. Pastors should be well versed in liturgy and not just make things up, right? And that's why you see like tabernacles sort of move to the sides of churches. And in my case, maybe I said this before, but I was at a church where the tabernacle was at the back of the church.
Yeah.
Like the back of the church. That's not a joke. It's still there to this day. So all these things were being done. The problem with them is all of that stuff communicates something to people. That what we're doing here is no longer sacred. Like, what we're doing here is no longer something that the church is asking us to do. It's what we're deciding to do. And the liturgy is not ours to play around with. Like, when we come to worship God, that is a gift that God has given us. Like, and the church has given us to take and make part of our Sunday worship. It never was intended to be something that we receive and mold and change and take apart and add. Then it stops becoming the worship of God and starts becoming my own personal preference, right? Yeah. So like when you read the documents of Vatican II, it never intended to get rid of Latin. No. And in fact, it says that Latin, there are parts of the Mass that the faithful should know how to say and sing, like the parts of the Mass. And then I think specifically it mentions
the Creed and the Our Father
and the Our Father, right? So it says that right in our teachings, and when you come, like I'm just trying to think now. You got me going on all these terrible things that I remember as a child growing up in the.
I know. I was thinking the same.
Going to church in the 1990s. Like even the sanctuary. Remember when the sanctuary? Well, you probably don't remember, but there are churches who had an altar rail.
Yeah.
This was a way for people to receive communion, yes, but also it was a way to set apart that the sanctuary is the place that the sacred holy things happen in the church, right? And it set that part of the church apart. Like, this is the place where the sacrifice of the Mass will happen, where the minister in persona Christi is and his helpers, whatever it might be. When we took those out, we started inviting people. I remember as a kid
sitting around the altar.
Come in, everyone in the sanctuary, and hold hands for the Our Father. And that was supposed to be some sort of community thing. And it was like, now you got people stomping all up over the sanctuary. What it does is it communicates to people that the sanctuary is no longer holy. Like, that place of the church is no longer sacred. Like even in our parish, people who need to go into the sacristy for something, they'll just tread up through the sanctuary and go through the side door. And it's like, no, there's another way of getting to
There's
the
two
sacristy,
entrances, yeah.
without trudging through the sanctuary. This is the holy place that that should be set apart, right? Then, there were some churches that replaced the reading of scripture with poems and other literature that the priest thought
And
was
even-
better, or committees thought would be more entertaining for people.
Psalms. I remember being asked to do a funeral one time. One of the reasons that I'm still not doing funerals when I do music and stuff. But I remember going, okay, so what is the psalm that we're doing? Oh no, they want you to sing like an Elton John song. I'm like, for the psalm, and the priest is like, yeah, just sing it, and I'm like, is this a mass? Is this what we're doing? And that was just the regular and I remember arguing that no, the psalm is the psalm in a mass, but I can do a nice psalm, maybe the Lord is my shepherd or something. But nope, it was here's the song that they picked for you to do. I'm like, the psalm is not a song, it is a psalm, and it is something. There's a real reason for it, and it's
You've mentioned a whole other section of abuse, music.
Yeah.
Right? Like music that's been abused. I'm also thinking about other symbols or signs. Like I remember, priests used to wear stuff on their chasuble, like a pin for this cause or whatever. Heck, even a poppy. And that's not disrespect to our, deceased veterans or military. The church has a whole month that we dedicate to those who have died, right? But things we've replaced symbols, pins, this cause, that cause, whatever. And then people say, well, how come you're not wearing this pin, or how come you're not wearing that symbol or that sign or whatever? Almost the priest's chasuble became like a billboard.
Yeah, a political
and it was
symbol.
And it was I remember that growing up. It was okay, so all these areas where we could sort of change, for lack of better words, I guess, we tried to do, even in various ways. The problem is it communicated to people that what we're doing is no longer holy. And I believe that this is one of the reasons why so many people left the church in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s. And people will say, well, you don't know because society was kind of going that way anyways, they'll say.
Church shouldn't change.
The church shouldn't say. And the reason I know that that's wrong, I think, is today when you have parishes trying to do what the church says, following the teachings of the church, especially when it comes to the liturgy, you see growth in those parishes.
Yeah.
You see people coming back to church. You see people flooding those churches, right? So to me, it's
So that was the opposite of the expectation of the Second Vatican Council. So
Yeah.
one of the in the early discussion around how to permit extraordinary ministers of the Eucharist was the expectation that this was going to usher in an explosion of not just kind of mass attendance, but also vocations. And they said there's going to be a lag. So you're going to have a lot more people coming to church than we have time to train priests for. That is because seminary takes a while.
Yeah.
That there's okay, we need to have that. How do we process all of these people through receiving the sacraments if we only have one priest? And this many was extraordinary ministers, again with proper training, whatever. Now, extraordinary ministers aren't extraordinary ministers at all. They're common, and they're just there, and they're there for expedience to we'll
Keep the mass under
we'll
an
get
hour.
done mass faster if we have all of these people distributing Holy Communion. But the initial discussion around whether or not they should be permitted was that there's an expectation that after the council, the church is going to grow by exponential.
And that's a good point, because when it does talk about extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, it says that they're only supposed to be there when there are insufficient bishops, priests, or deacons, and only when the amount of time taken to distribute the Eucharist will be excessive.
Yeah.
So to me, 8 minutes is not excessive. 10 minutes is not excessive to give the Eucharist out, right? But you got churches, we got to be done in 2 minutes to distribute the Eucharist. So they have 6 extraordinary ministers of the Eucharist, giving the Eucharist out to people for like the 120 people that are in the church.
But that's the other again, what the intention is and what actually portrays is that, I think, to a lot of people, is that we're trying to get it done so we can get people out, but it's now glassing over. Like, if the Eucharist is a source in some of our faith, it's like the ultimate time. This is the whole pinnacle here. We're moving towards it and get it done as quickly as possible. Like, you know what I mean? That's kind of like, if that's the feeling of it, that just portrays something different than what's actually we're hoping to actually have go on. So I was just thinking about this, because we often have 2 songs for the communion time. And that's not like, I do the music for it, and I'm not picking out 2 songs for the reason of I really want to get 2 songs in there or something else. I pick out 2 songs because it takes that long to do communion. But what I find is, a lot of times people are reflecting on both songs. Either they're reflecting, like if you're at the back of the church, you're reflecting of what is going to be happening very shortly. You're going to be receiving the Eucharist. You can prepare your heart. It gives you that a little bit extra time to just enter into that moment. Or on the flip side, I just received the Eucharist. Now I can, now, like, you have that little bit of, it's in community and community prayer, but at the same time kind of private, with singing the song and everything else. So it gives that, like, that's the time, that's the whole service part. It's like go to graduation and, they have the valedictorian and everything else. We're there for the graduation, but what we're going to do is we're going to have everyone reach under their seat. There's your diploma. Thank you very much. Okay, we're done, and try to get it done as quickly as possible. So
Yeah.
Sorry, with what you were saying about what church looked like in the 90s, I feel like I kind of dodged that bullet.
You missed out.
Yeah.
Becoming Catholic as an adult. But I was going to say, when I became Catholic, I was actually surprised. It wasn't until after a couple of years. I was surprised that the liturgy wars were so contentious, and because I think, and you said, like, after the council, and you have people actually trying to revolutionize the church, and you have bad actors implementing things that they were knowingly kind of going against the spirit of the council. But the church that I attended, when I was doing RCIA and became Catholic, was really taking the full range of what Sacrosanctum Concilium has to say seriously. So, there was beautiful traditional music, but there was also, it was in the vernacular. Like, I found it accessible as somebody who had no liturgical experience up to that point. They used the mass parts, Latin and vernacular, interchangeably. So not only was I learning them in English, I was also learning them in Latin. And you have the initial revolutionaries, maybe bad actors, maybe just more enthusiasm than brains. But a few decades after that, a lot of people, it's not necessarily malice, it's probably a lack of awareness. So I think being able to point back to so we can point to this document, and I think people who claim to take liturgy seriously, reading Sacrosanctum Concilium specifically, would diffuse, like, I would say 90% of the tension in the current liturgy wars. But we also have other reference points that we can point to for how we should participate in liturgy, what our reference points should be. So, we have the general instruction of the Roman Missal. But for me, and these are kind of the official church teaching, but like the hermeneutic key, or the mode of interpretation for me, comes from Pope Benedict. Before he was Pope Benedict, he wrote a book called The Spirit of the Liturgy, and he was president. He was present at the council. He was the prefect for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. He was the Pope, so like he has,
a good idea.
Yes, he has kind of an authoritative vantage on each of these things, and he says exactly kind of what we're saying, that these things are perfectly reconcilable. You can have the full, active, and conscious participation of the laity. You can do this in a way that is in full continuity with the tradition of the church. You don't need to destroy sacred art. You don't need to destroy high altars. You don't need to you don't need to make the church into a gymnasium or a community center, or add all this pop music that might get a couple people excited now, but in 10 years, 15 years, it's going to be cringy and outdated, and it's just going to become irrelevant. And we can go back to, focusing on reverence, focusing on what the liturgy actually is.
Yeah.
It's not a product to be consumed. It's not something that, whether I'm hyper traditional or hyper progressive for whatever, like, it's not something that I can pick and choose what I like. It's something that I submit myself to. It's something that I try to be worthy to participate in.
Yeah, and Pope Benedict talked about the hermeneutics of continuity.
yeah.
That what was once sacred is not just not sacred today.
Yeah.
Like that's why to continue on that.
Yeah, in Summorum Pontificum, he
Yeah,
says,
exactly.
what was good, true, and beautiful and sacred for the church in ages past is still now. That
Yeah.
you can't just say that it's irrelevant or outmoded or just replaced by something more modern.
We're talking about like how sort of the irreverence communicated to people, that sort of you could take you could stretch the irreverence a little further. I think that changes to the liturgy that were irreverent or changes that were not needed, not necessary, not right, those also communicated to people that what the church says about certain things are debatable. Like you see that with people who stop going to mass every Sunday and show up when they want. You see that with people who receive the Eucharist when they want. It's almost instilled in them because of this kind of wishy-washy attitude after Vatican II in the 80s and 90s and stuff. That's how they kind of understood. And like you said, probably just a misunderstanding. Perhaps they were taught that way because with wishy-washy liturgy comes wishy-washy teaching. Right? And so some priests were even encouraging people, it's okay, you don't have to come to church every Sunday or whatever it might be, or you don't have to go to the sacrament of confession. That was another thing too. It was like wildly popular in the 90s to go to general absolution, and the church would be packed with people who didn't want to go to the sacrament of confession. And some priests would just absolve everyone at once. And like that was never permitted. It was, that's only permitted in an emergency situation. It became regular part of practice. And what did people do? I prefer that way, so I don't go to I don't go to confession anymore, or I prefer this. People say like, well, my preference is like I prefer to go to a church where I can receive the Eucharist even if I go to church once a month, or I prefer to go to a church where there is no Latin or whatever it might be. You know what I mean? So the worship became my preference and not like something that we do to come together to worship God. You see that even, with incense, when we use incense. Incense is part of our liturgies. We use incense. It should be used in celebrations of solemnities. Incense is part of our tradition of the church. And why did it disappear? Because people were like, I don't like it. I don't prefer it. Well, it doesn't matter what you prefer. Like, this is part of our worship, And today, how many churches use incense anymore? Not many. It's starting to come back a little bit, but it is prescribed for us to use in the liturgy. Like, we should be using it every Sunday. You know what I mean? But we don't use it because people complain. You see altar servers. Altar servers were people who assisted at the celebration of the Mass. And assisted the priest. The priest needed assistance to celebrate the Mass. These were young men who were assisting the priest. Then all of a sudden it became popular to just throw children in there who didn't know what they were doing, and they're up there, picking their nose and whatever, just to include people, and it became like anyone can go up there, and now they're not so much assisting the priest in the Mass as they are just sort of these ornaments that make the parish look fun and young. You know what I mean? And from young men who, when they were celebrating, assisting at the Mass, who were there close to the Eucharist, close to the priest in this special moment, where heaven meets earth, it inspired in these young men a vocation to the priesthood. Studies show that in Canada and the United States. Like high percentages of priests who were altar servers. Then what did we do to include everyone? We started saying, okay, well, children can come in, girls could come and serve now. And all of a sudden, in most parishes, altar servers disappeared. Why? Because they were more ornamental and more of a sort of a social thing that had to include everyone than a mission duty from the church to do this prescribed job, to assist the priest and to discern in your own life, is the Lord calling me to serve in this way while I'm here? Remember, in the sanctuary, which is not for everyone to be. So like all these things became a preference, and not what the church said. But I think that today, look at in 2011, the church released the new Roman Missal for English-speaking countries. What did it do? It cleaned up our language, right? So from more casual responses in the liturgy, the church released a more accurate translation from the Latin to say in English. What did people say? I prefer the other way. People said, well, okay, but this is what the church has prescribed for us now. Now it's normal. Now we're like 15 years later, and now it's normal. But remember the change at the time?
Yeah, I remember
Wasn't
it being
easy.
big thing. Yeah.
It wasn't easy to
November
change.
14th, 2011. I remember the day.
So, but that is an example of the church making corrections and saying, okay, what we did was in haste. It was too fast. Let's come back and correct it. And you're also starting to see, like in the Roman Missal itself, there are clear instructions. Like they're the words the priest says, and then there are clear instructions of what should be done.
Yeah,
right?
the actions.
And so you're seeing today, more churches are being more focused and intentional about doing things correctly. And it's not just about, doing things correctly. It's about honoring the fact that we're here to worship God and the church prescribes it this way. But you also see people's hearts, grow closer to Christ through the proper worship. Because now we are doing how the church prescribes. We're worshiping the way the church asks us to. We're not doing our own preference and standing there like a proud creator, and like just being so proud about our own ideas. And, that separates our heart from the Lord if we're there for our own creativity or ideas.
I think about that for the music, and just because I'm so heavily like in the liturgy, that's where my heart is. That's where I'm involved. But there's a difference between performing the music and leading worship, right? And so having that heart where you're praying and you're having the rest of the people that are singing with you praising and worshiping, and that choir, if they're praising, you can feel that. You know what I mean? Not only in the music, but I think it moves everybody else into worship. And so if all of our direction is to worship to God, that's all he wants from us. Like what he wants from us, that's how we are made whole, right? Is that worship, not only on a Sunday Mass, all throughout our lives, but specifically in front of the Eucharist, getting that daily dose or getting that weekly dose that we can. It's what makes us whole if we're doing it correctly.
Yeah, I agree. And remember, the commandment is to make the Lord's Day holy. It's a commandment for us to save that day for the Lord. The church says it's an obligation to be at Mass. And if it's an obligation to be at Mass, the church also prescribes a certain way that we worship. So anything outside of that way, I think, has to come to an end. But you're starting to see that more and more common today. So it's only a matter of time.
So
right?
where are the three areas what are the 3 or 4 references that people who want to look more into the liturgy, like if they're on the liturgy committee, where should they be looking?
Well, they can start by reading the Vatican II document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, that was promulgated by Pope Paul VI. They can also read the general instruction of the Roman Missal. That is our general instruction that we have for English-speaking countries on the liturgy. Those 2 documents would give lots of information and lots of explanation for people on how we celebrate the liturgy. But I would also recommend Pope Benedict's Cardinal Ratz.
Spirit of the Liturgy.
Spirit of the Liturgy. Yeah. Beautiful read. Anything else you'd add to that?
No, just and you said it that there is a generation of priests coming up who are just really taking this stuff seriously and looking at ways of trying to satisfy the principal aspect of something like Sacrosanctum Concilium. Like it is important that the laity are conscious, are active, and fully participating in the Mass. This doesn't mean a rejection of tradition. This doesn't mean a rejection of, being in continuity with the Church, from day one. And these things are very, very reconcilable to each other in a very beautiful way. that allows us to actually give ourselves over to liturgy rather than kind of try and take what we want from it.
Agreed. And you know what? There's so much we didn't even mention
Yeah.
today, like certain parts of the document from Vatican II, but also different ways that you saw disappear after Vatican II, like adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. We talked a little bit about the sacrament of confession, like all those things that we didn't mention, and ways that the church is discovering anew again. And I find when you teach people about them, people really come to flourish in their faith life. Anyways, because it's such a contentious issue, you might have a comment to share with us about what we've talked about today. So you can comment on our social media, or you can send us an email directly at askus@thecatholicbuzz.com. Maybe you've had an experience of an abuse in a liturgy, or maybe you're one of those who prefer things to go your way and not the way the church has prescribed. You can drop us a line and let us know, okay? And so that's all the time we have today. So for Josh Sullivan and Matt Van Milligan, my name is Father Daniele. We'll see you next time on The Catholic Buzz.